Episode 11, Joel McDurmon and Dispensationalism.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
I'm rising up with a full heart. I'm taking my strength from inside. I'm rising up with a new mind. I'm taking your words to the new behind. I'm coming up from underneath the wreck, from underneath the bank.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I'm very excited to have my first interview for the Anarcho-Christian Podcast, and it's with Joel McDurmon on the topic of dispensationalism. But before we begin, and if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button on whatever podcast you're using so not to miss any future episodes. And if you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. And this week we've had a new review on iTunes, and it was a 5-star rating and review from Neil before Zod, son of Jor-El. Love the name, by the way. And he said, I enjoy learning and hearing from a fellow Christian anarchist. Very thought-provoking and enlightening. Thank you, Zod. And I appreciate the time that you took to write that and leave the rating. So if anyone else is enjoying the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating and review, and it'll help others find our podcast. It'll help us grow the show. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast and you'd like to find other ways to help us grow the show, there's our Patreon page. And if you visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com, it'll take you to our Patreon page where you'll see a few different ways to donate to the show, either a one-time donation or a monthly donation through Patreon. So if you like what we're doing, hit the link and check out the options for support. So without further delay, here's the interview with Joel McDurmon on dispensationalism. All right. Well, I'm excited. Today I have on the line Joel McDurmon, and he is the author of more than 20 books. Most recently, he released The Problem of Slavery in Christian America, and he's the president of the American Vision. So, Joel, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. Thanks for being here. And Joel, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and the American Vision?
Certainly. American Vision is a biblical worldview ministry. It was founded in 1979 and has as its mission to restore America to its biblical foundations. Now, that's been going on for many decades now, of course, under the leadership of Gary DeMar, who's written considerably as well. And in 2015, I joined him in 2008, and in 2015 I took over as president. So we continue the same mission. We write on all kinds of biblical worldview topics, including the one you just listed on America's history, but also on apologetics and biblical studies of all kinds, including biblical prophecy and eschatology and things of that nature. Personally, I went to seminary in Philadelphia at Reformed Episcopal Seminary, which, despite the word Episcopal, was actually a conservative school. I always have to clarify that. And people hear that word and the alarm bells go off, and in this country, rightly so. But no, it was a small and conservative school, and got my MDiv in 2007, joined American Vision in 2008 as a writer and researcher, and then completed my PhD at a distance with Pretoria University in South Africa in 2012, I believe. So that's a little bit about me in that regard.
Well, that's great, and I appreciate the backstory on yourself and the American Vision. I learned a little bit about you from some articles that I saw on American Vision a while back, and just digging into the website and the Facebook page, and I appreciate a lot of the articles that I've seen come from it. And today, the topic that I'd like to discuss, it means a lot to me because of my first experiences with Christianity. It was a while back, of course, but when you learn about the Bible and Christianity in America, and especially in the South, you typically learn dispensationalism, I guess, is the way that you kind of just understand the Bible, whether you're taught outright or it's just kind of implied. And so could you explain what is dispensationalism?
Yeah, and again, that might be a big term that most people have never even heard and not realize that it's kind of the environment in which they've grown up in and the Bible's been taught to them. I know that when I became serious about Christ, I was a young man, about 20 years old, and I came to faith, active faith in the Assemblies of God. And they don't use the term dispensationalism. They don't use a lot of big words. But when I started studying for ministry there, it was already assumed in what is essentially their creed or their confession, which is the 16 fundamentals. And you will have a pre-tribulational view of the rapture. You will have a view of the rapture, and you will have a premillennial return of Christ, and you will believe in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth after that. All of those are tenets that are taken directly from the system of theology known as dispensationalism. And so, for me, it was like osmosis. I just absorbed this, and I was taught from that point on, this is what the Bible teaches. And I think that's true for many, many evangelicals. And then when you tie in the political and foreign policy aspects of that. So to your question, what is dispensationalism? It's a fairly new way of understanding the Scriptures, and it has several facets to it, but the most distinct and unique distinctions about it are that, number one, it has two people of God. It separates God's plan with the physical people of Israel from God's plan for his people of faith, the Gentiles, which is called today the church. And it separates these because it believes that God sent the Messiah to his Jewish people originally, but when they rejected him, God had to kind of shuffle around real quick, as it were, and create a plan B in order to kind of keep everything going. And so he put the whole restoration of his people Israel on hold for the time being while he sends the gospel out to the Gentiles. And when they come in by faith, he receives them. During this whole period of time in which this is going on, this is called the church age. And the church age is soon. We've been told it's any day now for over 70 years now. But soon is going to come to an end when Jesus comes back with no warning, with no signs to precede it, and rapture his church, just literally pull them out up into the air to be with him. And that it pulls the church out of the world, and it initiates this period of tribulation and persecution of the Jewish people back on earth for the next 7 years, after which that period of time Christ will come back physically to put his throne in Jerusalem and begin a reign of, I want to say terror, because it's a dictatorship headquartered in Jerusalem, in which he literally destroys all his enemies physically, smashing them to pieces. But that's getting into all the details.
Right.
And the most distinct parts of it are that it breaks history up into, depending on who you ask, 7 or 9 or 12 distinct periods, each one called a dispensation. And in each one of those dispensations, God deals with his people differently, so that the Adam and Eve were treated one way. After the fall, people were treated a different way. There was a different test. after that, he calls Abraham and initiates another period. There's a different test of faith during that period. Then the Mosaic period, and it goes on and on and on. We're currently living in a dispensation called the Church Age. And when it's over, God, like I said, will come back and reinstitute what he began with Christ originally, trying to bring the Jewish people to faith. And that will happen allegedly during the millennial reign. And so you have these 9 dispensations, or however many, and you have the distinction between Israel and the church, which is a hard distinction, and then kind of this pre-tribulational rapture of the church is also a distinctive of this system. So all those things are different facets, and they're kind of the outstanding major facets of the dispensational system. But like I said, this is what most Christians in the South and in evangelical circles, fundamentalists certainly, many evangelical circles up until probably the last generation or so, just understood as what the Bible teaches. And I'll just finish this little segment with this. So much so was just the status quo default for most Christians that when one of the most popular dispensational writers, Timothy LaHaye, dramatized the whole system with a fictional series called Left Behind, which all that series was, that 12 series of books was distinctly written according to dispensational theology. I forget how many millions of copies this set is in now. 40 million, I've heard 60 million copies sold of the Left Behind series. That's how popular it is among the general Christian population in the United States.
Yes, and even a few B movies as well, I think, came from that series.
Yeah. Kind of ironically, I believe that the star of those movies, Kirk Cameron, has since kind of, I don't think he holds those positions anymore. So
really?
I think the last time they wanted to make another movie, they had to switch to Nicolas Cage.
Yes.
I don't know what Cage is, but I doubt he's a dispensationalist either. I don't know.
Yes, I did think that was interesting that I saw that he was in one of those movies, but I don't think I've seen any of them except for maybe some clips from YouTube or something, and I wasn't sure how he fit in there or how the whole series fits together with the encyclopedia of books, their multi-volume set. So
this is not the first series either. There were movies made back in the 70s. You may know about them, called Thief in the Night.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Now, I saw it when I was in the Assemblies of God. This has been 25 years ago almost now, and it was dated already then because it had come from the 70s. But they terrorize these people with, if you miss the rapture, this tribulation is going to set in, and they're going to reinstitute beheading in order to get rid of all the Christians. Anybody who comes to faith in that period will be martyred because in Revelation 20 it talks about the souls that were beheaded there under the altar, saying, "Win, Lord." And so that means they have to bring back beheading as a punishment. So they have these scenes with guillotines in these 1970s movies that they're meant to terrorize children into making an impromptu decision for Christ, and it's just the worst way to go about the faith that there could be.
I agree. I grew up in the 80s, and I remember, that sort of scare tactic to making that, that prayer to, ask Jesus into your heart, is based off of that fear that, if you become addicted to video games or something like that, then you're going to be a junkie and then you won't go to heaven. And so I'm definitely familiar with that sort of tactic that was used then.
Yeah, and it's so antithetical to everything the New Testament teaches about conversion. I mean, the more I began to read the Bible, the more I saw through a lot of those fear tactics, and thankfully I came out and I went to the Reformed faith. That you just simply read a passage like in 1 John 4, I believe it is, that there is no fear in love. perfect love casts out fear because fear has torment. And when you begin to understand that passage, even on a surface level, it just starts making you ask questions about, okay, what's going on up here? They're using hell and tribulation as fear tactics to get people to say, I want to be saved. And that's just not right. So, I backed out of that. And that's not so much dispensationalism per se, but it's more of a kind of a free will versus grace view of things. But
and it really is
related to it.
Yes, exactly. And it really is what we've kind of discussed at the start, where it's kind of the assumed teaching. It's the assumed understanding. And I really appreciate your overview of dispensationalism. And you touched on a few things that I want to dig in a little bit on each one, and stuff that's happening now, as well as stuff in the past that all kind of keeps coming back to this dispensational view of the Bible and how it's played out. And we've talked socially now, and you hit on foreign policy. So I guess to start with digging down a little bit, we saw, I think it was about a week and a half ago from when we're recording this, that we had the new Israel embassy that opened up in Jerusalem. And there was a lot of excitement from the church in America concerning it. We saw the big unveiling, and some of the biggest names in televangelism was there, and everybody was very excited, with senators and everything. So can you explain where that excitement, for this new Jerusalem embassy, where does that really come from?
Sure. Well, I mean, a lot of it's tied into, and this is part of why dispensationalism succeeded so well in that era, in the last century, is because one of the things it did was it said, okay, if God's got his plan for the Jewish people, the physical Jewish people, yet to be fulfilled, and all of these prophecies of the Old Testament about the rebuilt temple and other things like that, which turns out aren't really prophecies for our time, but when you read them that way, you can make predictions. And so one of the things they predicted is, well, Israel has to be restored to its homeland. This was being theorized initially in the 1830s and the 19th century, and some people theorize that one of the big forces behind the Balfour Declaration were Christian Zionists who had imbibed this teaching. That was 1915, and yet there was not a mass movement to restore them to their land, and Israel was obviously not recognized as a state yet. And when that occurred in 1948, it was trumpeted everywhere by these teachers and all through the media, and it was seen as a fulfillment of prophecy. I mean, people felt like, wow, these people are right. Prophecy's being fulfilled right before our eyes. The Jewish people have been restored to their homeland. We could not have envisioned this, 70 or 100 years prior. And now they're being officially made into a nation state like the rest of us. So this must be real, right? And then, of course, in 1968, I think they had the war, that they withstood this war, and they were solidified. And so people began to really go nuts with the prophecy stuff in the 70s and 80s because of all these things. And it was all dispensational. So, there was really a lot of hysteria and mania, and it took hold so deeply in the fundamentalist and evangelical world that, like we said, it's the status quo. So now, when you see anything happening in Jerusalem that is pro-Israel or pro-Jewish, even if you couldn't find a Bible verse anywhere that said anything remotely about it, somebody in the dispensational community would act like this was a major thing in God's eyes because his people are dear to him, and we're to expect these events any day now. And, there's a lot to that, of course, but something like the United States moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which, of course, Jerusalem is so mentioned all through Scripture, right? It's the holy city.
Right.
That has to be big, and so they just play it up. Well, I mean, I suppose you can find any number of scriptures that talk about Zion and pray for the peace of Jerusalem, none of which are talking about physical, literal Jerusalem. Certainly not in today's time.
Right.
But the fact that it says that, you could see it, and it gets repeated and read and trumpeted and all that kind of stuff. So you couple with that with the fact that Israel is strategically important to the U.S. military and foreign policy objectives. It is the only ally to the United States in the Middle East, at least in that way. I do believe we have worked with a few others. But they're certainly our strongest and most natural ally. And so that creates this strategic bond. And so the government, the Defense Department, the Pentagon, has every incentive to keep this theology afloat and as robust as possible. So, of course, Trump, if I was Trump, I would want John Hagee over there given the best school possible as well. Because it only, for the time being at least, as a political pragmatic goal, it's only going to help our objectives. And all of these things come together to create kind of this political and social theological cocktail that's just very potent, very powerful, very difficult to address because, you know, the old saying is never discuss politics, sex, or religion in polite company. And, you know, right there, that's politics and religion together. I mean, all they got to do is add sex into the mix and they would have they'd write a new Bible. I don't know what would happen. But it's just, there's so much potency there that when people get their beliefs tied in with their nationalism, that it's almost impossible to persuade anyone of anything at that point because there's so much emotion and personality tied up with the issue that, it takes real skill and delicacy even to start the discussion that would be critical of those things. Now, of course, that's what we do at American Vision. We've been doing it for 35, going on 40 years now. And Gary DeMar, my predecessor, who still writes for us regularly, has spent a large portion of his career on eschatology and Bible prophecy. And his work on Matthew 24 is a book called Last Days Madness, is probably the finest book ever written on the topic. Phenomenal study of Matthew 24 and what those prophecies really mean coming out of Jesus' mouth. And modern day Israel has absolutely zero to do with it whatsoever. Another book he did more recently was called, we've published under the title, The Gog-Magog Alliance. And it's kind of an exegetical Bible study of Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is supposedly prophesying the Battle of Armageddon, which these people say is coming soon. And he shows how this is a past event. And other passages from the Bible make it clear it was a past event. So when you put these things into common sense context, all of the hype falls away from the state of Israel in our own time. And you realize that from God's perspective, it's just one more evangelism field. It's just one more people who need to hear the gospel and come to Christ by faith. And that is God's plan for man. And as long as they reject it, they're no different than Russia or China or any other nation that rejects God. I shouldn't say China rejects God because there's actually tremendous revivals there, but you get my point.
Absolutely.
Any other nation, they're no different than any other nation. So that's how we should look at those things.
Yeah, and it's definitely something that's so difficult when it comes to Israel. And you mentioned also, Jerusalem, and we have these terms that are viewed in a little bit different ways when we start talking about different eschatologies. And but how is it, what is the origin dispensationalism that has that I guess has us kind of mixed up on some of these terms.
Sure. Well, like I said, some of it started, the origins of it are usually traced back to 1830 and a man named John Nelson Darby. And there's even dispute over how he arrived at these views, but there's no dispute that by 1830 he was teaching what has become modern-day dispensational, the major distinctives anyway. There has been work I've seen going back a generation before him to a Hispanic Jesuit named Lacunza, I believe was his name. And his that he wrote, he was actually a converted Jew, it appears. And his works that he wrote seem to have drawn from Jewish mysticism or Jewish futurist traditions. And there is evidence, I've seen the case made, that was picked up later by other people and made it to John Nelson Darby. So that there actually is kind of a connection to Jewish mysticism that was pre-existent, and it wasn't made up by Darby. Now, that's a discussion for another time. But I think there's probably some merit to that view. And you see this pretty strong symbiosis between kind of Jewish Zionist forces. That sounds conspiratorial. I don't mean it to sound that way. To me, it's very real and practical. People who wanted to reinstitute a nation of Israel, people who were Jewish or Zionist at the turn of the last century, would naturally ally with these kinds of views in the Christian church in order to drum up support for their cause. And so to me, that's a no-brainer. So by the time you get to the Balfour Declaration in 1915, you've already got tremendous support from Christians and certain Christian movements. That's in Britain and the Commonwealth, of course. In the United States, these views were picked up and popularized tremendously by the publication of a Bible with study notes in it called the Scofield Reference Bible. And Scofield, that was published in 1909, I believe. And this is a study I've never fully figured out, but that, Scofield was not a major figure, but he had latched on to Darby's system, and he was strongly pro-Jewish and pro-Israel, and he wrote those views into the study notes of his study Bible. Mm-hmm. And the thing I've never figured out is how he got the clout to be published by Oxford University Press in New York City. It was one of the very first, if not the first, major publication that came out of Oxford's satellite office in New York City. And I've never seen, how and why they picked the reference to the Scofield Bible for this. But it would only make sense if there was Jewish influence there of some sort, Zionist influence, maybe some funding, I'm not sure, and picked up this pro-Israel study Bible and printed it. That, because it was King James and because it was new and fresh and these views were in the air, that became certainly the bestseller of the era. And who knows how many millions of copies that version of the Bible sold, and became the source by which millions of United States Christians, certainly in fundamentalist Baptist and Methodist circles and others, but mainly Baptist and then later Baptistic traditions like the Pentecostal and Charismatic groups, the source by which they were educated on what the Bible said about the future. And of course, it was a view that had been virtually invented in 1830. There were premillennialists before that in the church, but there was nothing like this pre-trib rapture and this reinstitution of the Jewish state view and what was taught by Darby and made it into Scofield's notes. And that just almost overnight became the norm, the status quo for millions of Christians in the United States. So the publication of that Bible, you might say, did more damage to us because of the falsehood of the views than any other single thing could have done. And then by the time that becomes a popular thing, by the 40s and 50s, you have the move to have seminaries and other Bible schools. The Moody Bible Institute, I forget when it was founded, but it picked up this view and taught it. Very influential, very widespread. There were other organizations. Dallas Seminary was founded. The two men that founded that were both dispensational, and then they had a famous Bible teacher named Louis Barrett Schaeffer, who was actually a Presbyterian, by the way. And he wrote a systematic theology. Then you had the Philadelphia College of the Bible, which today I think is Philadelphia Biblical University. Charles Ryrie was there. He was a major figure teaching these things in the next generation. And so you had these, it went the next step from just the popular grassroots movement to institutions that were teaching it everywhere. And so it kind of snowballed in many ways. So that what was the norm became an institutionalized norm and got some real clout behind it. And then, of course, you had Liberty University, which I don't know if it was ever officially Scofieldian, but it was certainly taught that. And I know Norm Geisler was a dispensationalist who's still there. I think maybe getting close to 90 years old. I don't know. But so anyway, this just ballooned over the whole century. And along with it balloons, the history of the Middle East over that time. And constantly, the people who are holding these doctrines are constantly looking to the Middle East at every drop of the hat, whether it's in Iran or Iraq or in Israel or Lebanon or whatever, thinking that this is somehow, in some way, tending toward the fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
Right.
And it is not. It has nothing to do whatsoever. So it's kind of a mass hysteria in many ways that really calls and begs for more discussion, more debate, more open analysis in the conservative Christian world. Thankfully, that's beginning to happen, by the way. You probably want to ask me other questions, and I'm rambling here, but I know there's the classical dispensational model in the institutions has pretty much crumbled. The only people still teaching that are Master's Seminary with John MacArthur, and I'm not sure who else is, but many of the other institutions like Dallas that we mentioned has moved to more of a progressive, a modified, moderate view of dispensationalism, and some have moved even further away into their different views. I forget all the names, Kingdom Through Covenant, and I forget what all the different views are now, but the only place that hardcore classical dispensationalism still lives on is at Mary and in the fiction, the legend. So it's basically a fictional theology at this point. And thus it still has powerful grasp over people's minds. Now, I will add this. Just because the theology is no longer really backed by that many people institutionally, it still has a powerful grip at the grassroots level. People still believe it, and even if they don't have the whole dispensational system in mind, they still believe in the major aspects, like the importance of the future of physical Israel, the rapture of the church, and all of those pieces, right. So that it still has very deep roots in the modern Christian mind. So, how we got there and where we are exactly. There was a documentary that came out a few years ago. I wrote an article about it, and it was called Waiting for Armageddon. And it was done by a non-Christian guy who was kind of on the outside looking in. And he interviewed several people. Some of them just kind of got in these families' lives and how the view of the last days madness that they believed really consumed their lives. And it was a powerful documentary. And I recommend watching it and read my article about it. I think it was called Life, Death, and the Last Days or something of that nature on our website. And it really shows how when your outlook is that Jesus is coming back any day, this world is going to hell in a handbasket. It's being corrupt, and it's going to get more corrupt. Jesus is going to come rapture us out of it, and then institute his military rule after 7 years and we're not even going to be here. What does that do to your outlook in the world? What does that do to your planning, your child raising, and in general, your evangelism and what you think the church is here to do? Well, I mean, it completely nullifies all of it. And this documentary revealed that. They didn't even go out about asking those questions, but it just came out naturally. One of the ladies basically says, they were sitting at a dining table with these lady and her two daughters, the teenage daughters, 14 or 16 or something like that. And one of the daughters was like, well, I really hope the rapture doesn't happen too soon because, I want to live a normal life and get married and have children. And like that's not going to happen. You're going to be raptured out of here before any of that happens. And I was just shocked. I was like, dude, look what this does to your parenting and how you treat your children. And this girl, later, they interviewed her in private, and she was just on the point of tears, there's hopelessness in their voice. And I'm like, this is terrible. You've robbed people of what God's called us to do. And that is going to make disciples of all nations, teaching them all things He's commanded us, and to love one another, to help the poor, to help the sick, to repair, to restore, all of these great things. And the sanctification that comes with long-term parenting and homeschooling and marriage and all those things is a huge aspect of what it means to be a Christian. Paul tells us that in Ephesians 5. And when your whole life is consumed with, hey, Jesus is coming back any day, this is all corrupt, it's going to be burned away, and I'm not even going to be here. That completely destroys your outlook. It changes your future.
Right.
So it's been kind of an unofficial motto at American Vision all these years that eschatology matters. Your view of the end times matters, and you need to have that right. You don't need off in the way that does. And it's done it to the whole church, not just individuals like I just described. That view has consumed the entire fundamentalist and much of the evangelical world, and it has put them on the sidelines, completely uninvolved in social matters, political matters, with the exception of anything that's pro-Israel, of course.
Right.
But other than that, if it's race, if it's economics, if it's welfare, if it's statism, if it's police, if it's criminal justice, if it's 100 other things, all of which the Bible addresses, they say, I could care less because it's all corrupt and I'm not going to be here. So that view has to go, and you have to get back to what the Bible teaches about the long-term outlook of the Christian church and our calling in society as it is now. And that's what we stand for and what we do in American Vision.
Yeah, I completely agree with how consuming the theology is, how consuming, all these little points are, and it definitely affects everything in our lives, like you mentioned, from the families to foreign policy, and just we become so focused on that rapture and physical Israel that we're not paying attention to anything else. And one of the articles that I read before before I reached out to you was by Gary North, and it was called "The Prophecy Clock Has Now Run Out for Dispensationalism," and I thought that was a great term, the prophecy clock, and it's something that I've definitely seen and in this thinking. And I guess, can you explain this idea of a prophecy clock that's so relevant to dispensationalism, and how that clock has to do with what you've talked about with Israel, and where does this idea of the clock really come from?
Yeah, absolutely. It really goes back to Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks. And this is a real peculiar, strange aspect of dispensationalism that they talk about quite a bit, but they don't really ever prove from the Bible. If you go read the prophecy of Daniel's 70 weeks, he outlines what is to happen in these 70 weeks, which he tells you is actually 77s of years, so a 490-year prophecy. And at one point he says, well, the prince will come that will cut off the sacrifices and put an end to the sacrifices, and we'll go from there. Well, that happens in the last week of Daniel's prophecy, and the problem is, if you look at that in a traditional Christian way, that's obviously Jesus Christ coming and making the final sacrifice. There are no sacrifices after that. But that can't happen with the dispensational model. They need the temple to be rebuilt in Israel. They want the Jews to reinstate their own sacrifices and then have the Messiah come back for the Jewish people. And so they had to, in their theology, insert a hiatus in Daniel's 70 weeks. And so they say, okay, you get up to the 69th week, and then suddenly God puts everything on hold, and this plan B comes in. And some called it plan B, and another one called it the Great Parenthesis. And, okay, here we are, this parenthesis in God's plan, and Daniel's 70 weeks has lasted, 2,000-something years now. And we're going on that. And at some point, when Israel becomes a nation again, and of course it depends on who you ask what the actual sign is, when Israel becomes a nation again, and Christ can come back and they can rebuild the temple and all that, then that parenthesis will be over, and the clock of prophecy, Daniel's clock of prophecy, will begin again. And of course, Jesus had told them in Matthew 24, when these things take place, this generation will not pass until all these things are fulfilled. And instead of interpreting that the way it's written, as Jesus speaking to the generation that was then living, that would not pass before everything would take place, and it did, by the way, then they say, well, this was all part of that hiatus. It's awaiting the restarting of the prophecy clock into the future, and when that clock starts again, then that generation will start again. Well, when Israel came back to its land and became a nation again in 1948, you had prophecy teachers all over the place saying, this is it. This is the beginning of the generation of which Jesus was speaking. All these things will now take place. So, anything that happened in Israel since then has been interpreted as somehow fulfilling Matthew 24 or the Gog and Magog prophecy or part of Revelation or something like that. And the problem is that in 1948, it was always taking the generation at 40 years. All through Scripture, you hear 40 years, 40 years, 40 years. And that was taken to be what the generation span was.
Right.
So there were prophecy books from 40 years is 1988. So, okay, 1988, it's got to happen, right? We've got to look for the rapture to happen. And there were books written, 88 reasons why the rapture, Christ will come back in 88. And, of course, 1988 came and went, and that absolutely failed. Hal Lindsey had made predictions like that as well. So then what do? They said, well, maybe actually 40 years is not right. Maybe a generation is 70 years.
Right.
And so that was kind of the latest, I would call it the last gasp, maybe, of that view, of still trying to hang on to that prophecy clock starting in 1948. Well, the anniversary of Israel becoming a nation again just passed, and I think it was May 21st or something like that, of this month was the 70th anniversary. So, hey, your prophecy clock is over.
Again.
That was the point here. Was to point out, okay, maybe it was over the last time, but it's really over now, guys. Come on, it's into this madness. And of course, it hasn't ended the madness for those types of teachers one bit. You won't hear any one of them anywhere say, well, we were wrong, we need to go back and reassess our system. And nor will they give people their money back for the last book they sold that had all the wrong predictions in it. There was one guy who did that. Demar writes about that somewhere. And God bless that guy for saying I was wrong and giving the money back to the people. But I mean, all these books by Tim LaHaye and the millions of dollars that have been spent on all this stuff, probably more than that, probably near all told, all put together, it's got to be in the billions of dollars spent on this fantastical theology, which is not true and has deceived millions of people and has sidelined the church and society and has had all kinds of catastrophic consequences socially and spiritually speaking for so many people. And that clock is over, and people need to realize that this was wrong and it's a scam. There was never, to begin with, a parenthesis in Daniel's 70 weeks. There was never a time when the original clock stopped so that it would have to start again and count down. This is all made up fairy tales, and we need to get beyond it and get back to a more solid understanding of what the Scripture teaches.
Right. I've definitely been there in conversations, even from way back where when I started kind of waking up from this assumed teaching that, I kept seeing every single event, especially in Israel or the Middle East, kind of just being plugged in. And when that particular prophecy didn't happen, well, it was just kind of readjusted and like what we see with the Hal Lindsey books and from the 80s. And then, I remember some of the discussions that I had, it was 88, and then, well, they just put another 20 years on. Maybe we were wrong and put another 20 years on. Now we're talking about 60 years for the generation, and just reinterpreting it over and over again, always sticking in the newest foreign policy event that's happening and trying to figure out who's who. And that was really my experience with trying to really figure out, really look into it. And it really did expose that this way of thinking was an incorrect way of reading the Scripture. And what I'm interested in at this point, you've mentioned a couple of Bible verses and passages that are used, or at least are interpreted a certain way, have little thoughts stuck into it. But would you mind going into a few key biblical, verses that are, I guess, used as evidence, and feel free to even refute them as well.
Yeah, well, here's how I would look at it. I mean, first of all, the biggest evidence is what's not said, which I just called gap in Daniel's 70, which you have to put that there. I mean, these people came up with an idea of the physical Jewish people being a kind of a parallel covenant people to have another visitation from their Messiah in the future. It's a parallel track to what God's doing in the church. And in order to make that work, in order to make that made-up system work, they had to insert a gap in Daniel's 70 weeks. So they go back to that prophecy, and they literally just put it in the text like they take a hammer and chisel and drive it right in the middle of the Bible and put a wedge there. That's not there. Just read it. And so that's one thing. Second of all is this distinction between Israel and the church as two sets of God's people. That is not the case. The seed that was promised in the promise that was given to Abraham back in Genesis 12, that those who bless you I will bless, and those who curse you I will curse, and the seed that would come and all that. I'm not talking about the physical blood all through even the Old Testament. Israelite, you could die in the wilderness and be lost. You could be held accountable for your unbelief, and you would suffer the fate of any unbeliever. Likewise, you could be a Gentile, like Ruth, or several others all through the Old Testament, who were not of Jewish blood, but had faith, and were accepted into the covenant people. So it was never the fact that you were Jewish that God was keeping his promise to you. It was the fact that he used those people to bring us the seed, as Galatians says, the Messiah, to whom the promise was made. And it's very explicit in saying that. All those promises were made to Jesus. And it's us who believe and find ourselves in Jesus that are partakers of those promises. The land promise was symbolic of inheriting the earth in Christ. We could go on and on and on in all those things. But It was never meant to be the state of the blind of Abraham. It is the mistake. That theology is the mistake of following not Abraham's faith, but Abraham's blood.
Right.
And that is not the deal of Scripture. So, and I don't find myself saying, okay, dispensationalism says this, and that passage is wrong. Here's how you should understand it. There is some of that if those verses came up. But I say those couple things. First of all, the Daniel 70 weeks and the promise made unto the seed, which was Jesus. But what I like to do is step back and say, hey, look at God's promise to Jesus in Psalm 110:1. It's the most quoted passage in the New Testament. And I do a talk on this. I call it God's favorite Bible passage. Because, God is always referencing Old Testament passages in the New Testament.
Uh-huh.
And this one is quoted by far more than any other. I think the second most referenced passage is love your neighbor as yourself, is quoted or referenced 9 times in the New Testament. Psalm 110:1, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool, is referenced 27 times in the New Testament. Wow. And when you study how the New Testament applies that passage, you'll come up with, and I don't have the time to go through all of it now, but you'll come up with these points. It refers to Jesus Christ. Okay, Jesus says it refers to him. Mm-hmm. Peter says it is fulfilled on the day of Pentecost. Okay, we're not waiting for a future 1,000 years from now or in our future fulfillment. Peter said, Jesus fulfilled the sitting at God's right hand until God makes all his enemies his footstool on the day of Pentecost. He said that was fulfilled in their time. You go to the book of Hebrews, and you will see that it is referenced in there twice, and one of those times says he will sit there expecting, he will stay at that seat expecting his enemies to be made his footstool. Okay? And 1 Corinthians 15, Paul quotes the same verse, says that Jesus is going to sit there at God's right hand until all of his enemies are made his footstool, and the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. Okay? Mm-hmm. So until death is destroyed in that way, and every enemy of Christ is defeated, Christ is not leaving that throne to come back. Okay? So he's not coming back for any so-called rapture, no matter how you interpret those passages. He's not coming back for a final judgment or a tribulation or anything. He's not coming back until through the church, by the power of the Holy Spirit, all of his enemies are overcome in history. And then the end comes. So you study that one passage, and you don't have any other alternative. It's no premillennialism, no historicism, certainly dispensationalism, no all-millennialism. You have what's called postmillennialism, but I think it should be a little bit better defined than that with a better name. But that's basically where you will arrive. If you study how Scripture uses Psalm 110:1, you have no way to arrive at any view except that Christ is on that throne now, ruling the nations through his church by the Holy Spirit, and he's not getting off that throne and coming back one day sooner before every one of his enemies is destroyed.
Right, and with, you mentioned postmillennialism, I understand that there are, I think, just a couple of other ways that the millennial reign is interpreted. And so we have the dispensationalism and the postmillennialism. And from what I understand, there's also the amillennialism. And are there a few places that you would point our listeners to that would be, I guess, good references, either books or interviews or something that, for really digging into some of these other views, rather than just this has been a great discussion on why dispensationalism doesn't work. What would be some good references for people to dig into some of the other ideas?
Certainly. Well, I mean, if you're looking for what we believe the Bible teaches, mm-hmm. Like I said, Gary DeMar and I have dealt with this. Certainly Gary more than myself, but myself also have dealt with this for 30 years. And so American Vision, in our store, we carry a multitude of resources on all of these passages. And if you're looking for something that just covers some of the other millennial views, you can see the more modern book, one of the 3 Views books. I think Zondervan puts them out. And Ken Gentry gives, I believe, in the last one, the post-millennial view, and a couple other fellows give other views. So you can read those for that kind of education. Certainly that's also covered in Kenneth Gentry's book, what is the name of that? He Shall Have Dominion, which is kind of a definitive magnum opus on the post-millennial view, but also treats the other. At American Vision, we carry a book by David Chilton called Paradise Restored, which will cover also some of those things with a lot of hermeneutical issues on how to understand and interpret Scripture. That is a fabulous book. That should be read by every Christian. So, like I said, there's just a multitude of resources. If you want to study the book of Revelation, we've got books on that. If you want to study the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, we've got more than one book on that. I did a book a while back called Jesus versus Jerusalem, which is a commentary on Jesus' parables in Luke 9 through 20. And most people don't realize those are all eschatological. He is preaching to that generation about a coming destruction in that generation throughout that whole period. So, like I said, and we've got audio and video series on this. Gary DeMar has done debates on it we have the videos for those. A while back, we actually did Gary did a symposium. I believe it was in Las Vegas with some other fellows like Sam Storms, and I forget who else was involved. I believe Sam Storms was one of them. Maybe I got the wrong name off the top of my head. But there was a symposium of millennial views. They all got together and talked and gave some speeches and had some kind of moderate level of back and forth together on panels. We have the video of that up available. So there's just no end to the amount of resources that we have on this topic.
That's fantastic. I appreciate that, and like I said, growing up with this as the assumed understanding of all these passages, most people, when interested in this topic, they just get directed to the Left Behind series and things like that. So I'm definitely going to have these books that you mentioned in the show notes for this episode, and I really appreciate this overview of dispensationalism and its effects today, and as well as its history. And if you could, as we wrap this up, just let the audience know where we can go to get these books, where we can find the American Vision and other things that you're putting out there.
Absolutely. Well, the website is AmericanVision.org. You can find us there. There's a link to our store on that page, and you can surf all of our scores of resources there, not just on eschatology, but other aspects of biblical worldview and history, as I said before. So certainly check that out. We're on Facebook. I'm very active on Facebook. I post content almost every day in some form or another. And so we're there. I just literally last week started a podcast called The Devoted Word, which is an American Vision production. You can find that on YouTube, and we post it also to Facebook. So all those venues, and I'm on Facebook and social media, all of those outlets were there to reach out. So like, share, visit the website and store.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. Again, I'm going to have the links to all the books and the podcast and the American Vision in the show notes. And Joel, I really appreciate your time, and thank you. And I hope we can do this again.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, or let me know through Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. And if you liked it, we'll set up some more of these interviews, change it up a little bit. I'll have the links that I mentioned in the interview for the books, for the American Vision, for different places where you can contact Joel. And I'll have all of that in the show notes. And until next time, grace and peace. No king but Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com. Like us on Facebook.com/anarchochristian and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.